knew me, you would know that I am. Now, you don't need to answer out loud. Although that would be interesting. We could go around the room and have one big group therapy session. Something that we all seek in each other, something we all look for in our public figures and our leaders is authenticity. As my dear mother used to say, the genuine article. At work and our relationships with family and friends here at church, we just count on each other to be real, to be authentic. For one thing, we've all known people who've not been to an article, someone who has let us down, someone who's wasted our time, someone who has caused us grief. So being authentic is something that we need from others in order to really connect and to get things done and to have positive and trust-filled relationships. But it's a two-way street. In order to connect with others, to get things done and to have positive, trusting relationships, we have to be authentic also. Now, most of us probably believe we already are, but think back to that statement that I asked you to make. If you really knew me, you'd know that. How many of us could complete that sentence in public? For a lot of us, it would take a great deal of courage and a lot of vulnerability to be able to say that out loud, to be that. Now, children, they come by authenticity naturally, and that makes me believe that authenticity is a natural impulse. It's a built-in way of being. Young child, after all, is yet to experience all the bumps and bruises and disappointments that we acquire during a lifetime. Children lack the facade that most of us carefully construct to conceal the effects of our hard-earned life lessons, that shell that protects us from pain, or so we think. It's not that we can't be genuine, but we all have a certain awareness that in order to fit in or just to be polite or to not be thought of as unstable, there are some things that are left unspoken. That can include things like our legal issues, family problems, but also just our thoughts and feelings. Children, though, they haven't gotten that memo yet. They will be very honest, very real. They will tell you what they think, how they feel, and who they are. One of my favorite children depicted in Scripture is Samuel. He's the main character in our Bible story today, and he is just a child. He works as a sort of servant and pupil for the chief priest named Eli. Apparently, Samuel was in training to be a priest one day himself, so this was sort of his internship. One night, deep in the middle of the night, he hears a voice calling his name, Samuel, Samuel. And since Eli is the only other person in the place, Samuel naturally thinks it must be Eli calling to him. So he goes to Eli, who's asleep, and Eli has no idea what Samuel's talking about and sends him away. And in a classic storytelling formula, this happens 2 more times before it finally dawns on Eli that Samuel, after all, is sleeping in the very same room as the Ark of the Covenant. Now, we've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? The Ark is this big gold box about the size of a steamer trunk containing what is left of the tablets of the original 10 Commandments. The very presence of God, of Yahweh, was said to dwell right on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And at least according to Steven Spielberg, you're never ever supposed to pry open the lid unless you want your face to melt off. So Eli says to Samuel, okay, listen, go back in there. And this time, just be yourself. Be real. Have courage. And say, I'm here. I'm listening. And that's what Samuel does, and the story goes on to say that Yahweh tells Samuel something that is later shown to be true. And that essential truth about Samuel was that everyone from that point on in his long life knew not only that he was a prophet, but that he was trustworthy, which put Samuel in stark contrast to the sons of Eli, these were the guys who were in line to become high officials, just like their father. The problem was the sons were corrupt. They were liars and cheats and just up to no good in general. Not Samuel, though. Samuel was pure. He was real. He was authentic. Just as he had demonstrated as a child, in his career, he listened. He had courage. He spoke the truth, quite often truth to power. Now, Samuel was an average person. He was no Superman. He often had doubts and fears, and he even argued with God. He even ran away at times to hide. But if you follow his career as a prophet and a leader of the people, even if people did not always appreciate everything that he had to say, he was admired and he was respected because Samuel was the genuine article. And because he was so authentic, he had the freedom to follow the vision of the reconciling, gracious, loving intention of God he was called to pursue. Mike Robbins wrote a book several years ago called Be Yourself. Everyone else is already taken. I love that title. And he writes that authenticity exists on a continuum. There's a spectrum of authenticity. On one end of the spectrum, there's what he calls phony, unauthentic. In the middle, there is honesty. And at the far end is authenticity. He says we all know what it's like to be phony. Most of the time, we don't set out to deceive people or lie in any overt or harmful way, hopefully. It usually has to do with withholding the truth or massaging it a little bit, spinning things in a certain way. For most of us who are not named George Santos, it's not a chronic situation, but usually situational. The speed limit was what? Oh, my goodness gracious. Or it comes about when we were doing or saying I think we are supposed to do in order to appear competent, or to get what we believe we need at the moment, or simply not to cause a problem, or just to be polite. If someone steps on your toes, whether it's literally or figuratively, you might say, don't worry, I'm fine, when actually you're in a great deal of pain. So not being completely authentic can sometimes be rather benign. But the thing is, regularly operating from a place of phoniness is really stressful for us and for everyone else. It's not conducive to building trust. It's not emotionally sustainable or healthy for us or anyone else. So as you move along this continuum, the midpoint of it is honest. Honest is a lot better than phony. Honesty is the best policy and all that. The thing is, we know that there are some situations when honesty is not the best policy, and that's not something you'll hear a preacher say very often. But we know that honesty can be tricky if we're honest, and because we've all had these experiences where we've been honest, but in doing so, we've actually created a problem, or we've hurt someone else's feelings unintentionally, or we made a bigger deal out of something than it needed to be. Most of us have the experience of being honest, and it's been, in hindsight, a bad move, or it's been controversial, or it's maybe gotten us into trouble. Honesty, though, has a lot to do with our sense of justice and fair play and how wired that we personally are to follow the rules. But the greatest challenges of honesty is understanding the difference between being honest and being self-righteous or judgmental. Often without realizing it, we can justify our judgment of others as honesty, when our true deeper need is really to affirm and protect our need to be right. A lot of disputes come about this way. Because, for instance, if we've already staked our reputation or our standing on a certain position, it can be challenging to truly consider another point of view. It can create a lot of internal discomfort to turn around and admit that we were wrong. It's often easier and more expedient to avoid that discomfort altogether by judging someone else's opinion or way of being as wrong, and then to say, well, I'm just being honest about that. But what we've often done is to paint ourselves into a corner. I once knew a man whose son was gay. This man just believes equated being gay with being sinful. So even though he loved his son, he could not reconcile himself to accepting his son as he was. The man told me that to accept his son would be the same thing, tantamount to repudiating his faith, and he simply couldn't do that. And that caused him great pain. It caused his son great pain. The father insisted, his line was, he was only being honest to his convictions. But what I observed was that both father and son were trapped in the father's need to be right, because his need to be right formed so much of his identity. I learned from that experience that if honesty results in pain, without the possibility of peace and reconciliation, if it creates a trap, if it paints us in a corner, then whatever we're calling honesty really isn't working real well. What's required is something more, something that brings true freedom, and that is authenticity. Authenticity is on the opposite side of the spectrum from phony. Authenticity is being absolutely honest, minus the self-righteousness and our need to be right, minus the judgment. Authenticity is honesty that is combined with vulnerability. And vulnerability is both liberating and it can be really frightening. Most of us have been taught all of our lives not to make ourselves vulnerable or to appear vulnerable, because that can be equated with weakness. And maybe we've learned not to be vulnerable because when we've allowed ourselves to be vulnerable in the past, people have hurt our feelings or manipulated us, or they've used things against us. Based on all of that, we tend to protect ourselves from vulnerability, but it's when we can embrace vulnerability that we can be authentic. Well, the problem with being vulnerable is that we think we have to, in our society, somehow appear to be perfect. Because if we're not, then we won't be accepted and loved, and we might be perceived as if we are damaged goods. But that is horribly wrong. Making mistakes is only human. We all mess up. And things that are not our fault at all happen to us. Things that leave a mark. But they are things that we don't want anyone else to know about. We're kind of like those cans of vegetables on a grocery store shelf. Real life means that we will get dropped from the shelf and dented, and our labels will be torn. Being vulnerable is to acknowledge those dents and those tears, the self-inflicted ones and those that we have suffered, and then to seek not to pretend to conceal, but to be who we are. It allows us to let go of the pressure-filled, stress-inducing perfection demands that we so often place on ourselves. It takes courage to be vulnerable. But vulnerability helps us build trust, and it helps us connect to each other, and it's essential to building a life that's authentic. A useful metaphor for authenticity is an iceberg. Above the water surface, what do we see? Only the tip of the iceberg. The whole iceberg, the tip that's visible above the water, and the great mass of it, most of the iceberg below the surface, that's our authentic self. Authenticity gives us the freedom to be ourselves and to be comfortable with who we are. It lets us connect with other people in meaningful and genuine ways. And authenticity, I firmly believe, is what God desires for us and for our relationships. To build and make better the kind of world we seek. A world where in our families, in our community, in our nation, In our world, we listen to one another. We trust one another. And we do right by one another. That requires authenticity. God knows we are not perfect, but that is okay because perfection is never required of us. If God already loves and accepts us as we are, then we need to cut ourselves and each other some slack. We are meant to live in the freedom of being our true selves and the freedom of knowing that we are loved and accepted just as we are, dents and all. I was a counselor at a summer camp, church camp, for high schoolers one summer. Now, church camp can be a great experience, great spiritual experience, but it can also be filled with plenty of drama. Because compressed into a single week, there's more than enough envy, gossip, romances, breakups, insecurities, laughter, and tears to fill up an entire calendar year. Now, church camp, it really ought to be a place where you're free to be who you are, a safe space to share your feelings. But just like the real world, there's the fear of putting yourself out there too much, or you might get hurt. There's the fear of rejection, that you won't fit in. There was a young girl in my group of campers who had been kind of withdrawn. She kept to herself, didn't talk much. No one else at camp knew her, had ever met her. She was the only person there who had come from her particular church. Some of the other kids, because she was so quiet and withdrawn, they thought she was weird. Others suspected she might be on drugs. Midway through the week, we had a game in our group that is called Two Truths and a Lie. Have any of you ever played that? You go around the circle and you say two accurate things about yourself and then one thing that's completely made up. And the rest of the group has to guess which one of those three things is not true, is a lie. Fairly harmless game. For instance, I drive a Mazda. I sing in the choir. I climbed Mount Everest. Which one do you think's a lie? Thank you. Well, when it got to be this young lady's turn, she said this. Two truths and a lie. She said, I'm from San Antonio. I'm 16 years old. And my dad committed suicide 4 weeks ago. We all just stared at her. That was a really odd thing to say. And then I remembered. She was 16. But she was not from San Antonio. Her truth was that her grieving mom, trying just to put one foot in front of the other and figure out the next right thing to do, thought it best that her daughter should go ahead and attend church camp as had been planned. And she made her minister promise not to let any of the adults at the camp know what had happened. And so this 16-year-old girl came to camp. She didn't want to tell anyone about her father because she did not want to be the object of scrutiny or pity. She was afraid people wouldn't know what to do with her, what to say to her. She said she was afraid people would think something must be wrong with her if they knew what had happened. That she was damaged goods. But in that small group, she found the courage to be vulnerable. So we told her how brave she was and how loved she was. For the first time, after plenty of tears had been shed by everyone, she smiled. Even in her grief, she was unburdened. simply by being real. It was a gift to herself, most importantly, but it was also a gift to all of us. So we might imagine vulnerability as some kind of a weakness, but no, it is courage. It is authenticity. And when we're authentic, we give ourselves and everyone around us the best gift of all, the real us. With all of our pain, all of our joy, all of our dents, all of ourselves. That's who you and I are created and called to be. A genuine article.